Okay, cool.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry about that. Do you mind restarting?
I'm Nancy Lowe.
Still?
Why don't one of you stand up and say it? I'll test you. So you can I sort of am in two worlds between being an artist and a scientist. My formal training is as an artist from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, but I've also worked as a scientist, as a research tech in several labs, primarily with plants and insects. And I'm also interested in biological field stations and marine labs and how they can incorporate arts in their programs.
That was good. Do I just go now?
Yeah.
All right, so I was actually born on the Colby campus at the Thayer Hospital. And by the time I was 2, our family moved to Camden, and that's where I grew up and went through high school and searched the coastlines of all of the beaches from Lincolnville to Owl's Head and many of the islands. And then went to the Maine College of Art, which was at the time called the Portland School of Art. And then moved out to Santa Fe, New Mexico for 10 years. When I was at art school, I studied sculpture and ceramics. And when I was in New Mexico, I worked for some ceramic artists, but I dove in deep with printmaking. And so then after that period of time, I moved back to Maine, and now I live in Cushing. And so I continue to seek for things always. And okay, so I mean, you know, just to put it into context, like going to Lincolnville Beach, I remember a day when my brother and I caught close to 200 green crabs, you know, which we built the sandcastle with the moat, you know, hoping that we could get, you know, a huge catch before high tide came and swept them all back out. But you know, there was always a need to hunt for something, whether it was a salamander or a hermit crab, or I mean, I would hunt for snakes, you know, it didn't really matter. I just loved to find creatures. And I think that I started doing art at a very early age. And so somehow the two made sense, but it wasn't like an obvious direct moment of decision.
My name is Alexis. Right now I'm working at the Farnsworth Art Museum running a year-long program called Arts at the Intersection. And when I think about kind of my background and what brought me to this place called Maine, I think of myself as, and I am an anthropologist of education. So for a really long time, I've been interested in questions around social and cultural questions around spaces of learning and schooling, thinking through issues around power, who has access to decision making, what decisions are being made, and in whose name, who has a seat at the table. Things like who has voice in society and who's able to help impact change, policy change, for example. And oftentimes in a lot of the schooling and learning spaces, it's young people that may not have an opportunity to have a seat at the table, even though they're the ones that are most impacted by most of the decisions we make in those spaces. So that's been a question that's just really been with me for a really long time, and found myself here in Maine. I was working for Colby College teaching in their education studies department right before COVID, and decided to take a different path at that moment, and began working for the Farnsworth Art Museum, and was asked to develop a program that revived some of their arts integration work. And so doing that and integrating foundational skills like critical thinking, how to increase voice and choice in their everyday lives.
My name is Alaina Zyhowski, and I majored in environmental science with a concentration in water quality management at Ohio State. And on the same day that I graduated, I drove to a YMCA camp to be a summer camp counselor, and they kept me on staff for 2 years as a naturalist. I loved outdoor education and found it even more dynamic. than working in a lab or field setting on my own. And I dabbled in media studies for a little bit before getting certified to teach in the classroom. So at the camp, every half of the week, we were starting again and repeating the same courses. So I wanted to go to the next chapter and the next chapter and get to know the students over a whole year's time and see them grow. So I steadily substitute taught, long-term sub, got my own classroom, and was able to integrate subjects and do some project-based learning. But I really did miss those experiential elements in the outdoors and connecting students to place on a daily basis. So I was excited to find the posting at Herringut 3.5 years ago now, and I feel like I've bookended my teaching career with outdoor education, and that's where I really feel the most at home. And I've always been interested in science and the arts, so it feels natural to be able to be in a place that allows me to combine all those together.
That kind of leads us to our next question for everyone. So what got you involved in the arts and or sciences, and what made you decide to kind of integrate the two? We can start this end with Alaina. Okay.
I was definitely inspired by my dad growing up. He would take my sisters and I and my mom out on hikes. And even though some of my sisters were really wimpy and would scream if they saw ants or spiders, I would get really close and watch the ants and spiders and look for snakes. Same as what you were saying, just always hunting for creatures and being really excited when I found them. So I've always had an appreciation for the environment and all the parts of the ecosystem. And my mother was very creative, and she encouraged dance, singing, drawing, painting, all kinds of creative ways to express myself. And I was lucky to have a school system that also had really great art and science teachers, among other subjects, and was able to really just build skills throughout K-12 and bring those with me into college and beyond. So I feel really lucky about that.
I would say in my childhood and personal space, it's, I think, arts in particular have just always been there, whether it was parents buying supplies for a new hobby that I came up with, and it just wasn't really something that I saw as separate to anything else. So it felt very interdisciplinary, so I never saw it as something outside of other things. In my professional life, part of my degree, I was doing research in South Asia. Going back to those questions of trying to understand how different schools and different environments were providing access or increasing access for certain groups of people who may not have access to schooling, particularly in Pakistan is where I was at. And the arts became a pathway or an entry point for a lot of lower income and rural communities. For students to stay involved, for some parents really, really wanted their children to become educated, but there may not be a teacher in that village, but you could have other community members who were there to teach things that they knew, and it was often the arts that they could pass down. And so seeing these ways in which education was being in a lot of ways democratized, everyone could have access to this form of discipline of the arts, even though it was just fully integrated into everyone's lives, that changed my whole entire research trajectory to think about ways in which arts programs and the arts can be integrated, if they're not already, into other disciplines, in ways that, but in my childhood, just felt natural and outside of school. It was just there, and in other places where it wasn't always seen as something separate than other disciplines.
All right, well, I remember in 3rd grade that I was trying to get really good at drawing a few different creatures. And the 3 that I remember working pretty hard at was an owl, a mouse, and a porcupine. And I think I still have the owl and the porcupine drawing. And at some point along the line, and this has been a recurring haunt of mine, is how is it that all these different creatures like you know, like they have a tongue and they taste the food and they have blood and they like yawn, or, you know, like I'm just trying to figure out like how is it that we can share so many similar qualities about, you know, what is pretty significant to us, and these creatures have it too. So I think, you know, the part of the search was always to find out more information. Maybe it was to find out information about life. Maybe it was to find out information about truth. Maybe it was to find out about, you know, like the source, or, you know, and especially working with children, I like these 8th grade. I think the 8th grade kids are like at the pinnacle of it, right? Where it's before they start getting interested really in, you know, I don't know, the opposite sex or something. They seem like they're very creative then, and they're able to be more wild in what they might want to consider as an option or a possibility. And so I think I got stuck in the 8th grade mindset and have just continued to have questions. And I don't think that any of my work is answering any of the questions. It's just maybe even bringing up more questions or different juxtapositions of ways to think about it. And you know, the collaborating aspect of doing artwork is so enriching, especially when collaborating with science-minded people, because I have found that their observational skills are like, I don't know, 100%, and mine are like 60% of accuracy. Like it's not as important to me to do it exactly perfectly correct. It's more of like, what does the feel of that back or that, you know, like, I mean, I'm gonna go at it from a different angle just because of how I'm wired. So I think that the combining science and art has been not, again, anything that I figured out or masterminded at all. It was orchestrated into my life in a way that I have greatly benefited and am very thankful for.
I think that both artists and scientists continue to ask questions. I think that's kind of like, I'm really grateful you're still in that 8th grade mindset of just, you know, continuing to be curious. And I think for me, that's sort of where both my art and science curiosity comes from, is sort of digging into trying to find out about things. For me, as a scientist, I think my gateway drug was being a beekeeper. And that sort of drove me into learning more about entomology. My science background is more terrestrial organisms, mostly eastern forest ecosystems. And but I've always had an affinity for, you know, being outside. I'm obviously not from here. I'm from Atlanta originally. You can hear it in my voice. And came from kind of a wooded area and spent a lot of time out in the woods as a kid. And, you know, I don't know if any of y'all have read that book, Last Child in the Woods. It's a great book about the importance of connecting with nature in our youth. And a lot of us older folks did that, you know, just naturally. And I think those opportunities are not around as much anymore. But I spent a lot of time outside. I also spent a lot of time around art. We had lots of art in our house, and I was really fortunate to have that. My father, as a craftsperson, he was a violin maker and a guitar maker. So that sort of like affinity for working with the hands kind of came naturally to me.
And so the next question for everyone is, how or why do you think art can be used effectively for science communication? And you can just kind of popcorn in however you feel.
You know, there's this really cool book by Ellen Dissanayake, who is actually kind of a sort of an unorthodox scholar. She doesn't really come from a scholarly background, but she studied art history and anthropology and neuroscience and evolutionary biology. And she was looking at, like, her book is called What is Art For? And she's asking it as a kind of like evolutionary biology question. If art exists in all these cultures around the world and has throughout time, it must be adaptive for something. And so she's trying to find out, like, what is it that art, why does art exist in all of these cultures? And she concluded that those tribes that had art making as part of their practices were more connected. That art exists to connect us. That is the purpose of art, like from an evolutionary perspective, from a human being perspective, why we make art is to connect with others. And I think that's why we need it for science communication, because we need that connection, that personal connection, to sort of bring those messages into a place that hits our emotional selves and our social selves.
Piggybacking off of your comments, Nancy, I think with that art connection, you're adding an emotional component to data that might not be there initially. And so that can connect people and encourage them to feel for or against an issue, potentially take action to protect something if the story of the data implies that something needs protecting. And basically, so you're going from turning numbers into a visualization, such as a line graph, but then you may be going the next level and adding images or turning it into a three-dimensional sculpture and just connecting people into what is that about, you know, caught my attention, I want to know what this is, and then they could connect emotionally and take action from there.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a project that Alaina, Katie, and I've been, you helped start the community partner piece of this. One of the schools that I'm working with this year is North Haven Island Community School. And we started with Arts at the Intersection, started in their classroom back in the fall in September. And we always start, I start with the students to build trust. We start with a work of art and we ask them what they notice. And that starts conversations about what they're seeing, what they're observing. So building those observation skills, building the confidence over that class period and others of communicating about things that they can see, that they can document. And then we talk about why do you think that is the way it is? And some of the stuff is opinion based, but they can also defend those opinions when looking at these works of art. And so that group started with an ink and Essen high piece that has a lot of neon greens in it, very stylized landscape. And the student said, this reminds me of slime or synthetic fabric. I said, okay. So we started talking about why might they say that, what makes them say that. And they started talking about Shein. This is a company where you can go online and get a shirt for about $5 and it comes to your door very quickly. And these students who were living on an island started asking questions about, well, how do the things that we do on our island and the things that happen on the mainland, how do our decisions impact one another? And we started talking about fast fashion, met with Katie and Alaina, and they developed a workshop for these students. Herring Gut was our community partner for this class. It all started with a question about how does our decisions around the clothes we buy impact people around the world. So you start with the global, you span out to, or start the local, you span out to the global. For them, it was thinking about those connections between their island and the mainland back to the island, and how the water was a place where microplastics might be traveling. And so educators here took us out to Sandy Beach in Rockland, and we combed the sand to look for microplastics, brought it back to the lab. These are things that I could not talk about. And so having art as the starting point got us to this investigation, helping us understand how our decisions impact one another. And then you can start talking, I mean, these are middle schoolers, so you start talking slowly about, is there something bigger going on here, or is this an individual's decision? So you can start talking about systemic issues that are much larger than one community, and those will have ripple effects throughout their time in school. We won't, I think, have the ability to ask questions and keep coming back to questions is the beauty about art, and having science there as well, and using the two to kind of explore questions with one another.
And we're looking forward to seeing their culminating piece too, that communicates about the fast fashion and the impact on marine ecosystem potentially.
Yeah, so they are working with an artist, Tori Marsh, and doing a punch needle tapestry using synthetic fibers and natural fibers to express to other people kind of these questions that they've been thinking through. So that will go on display in our student exhibition May 17th. So it's a 5 foot by 4 foot punch needle tapestry that 7 students are creating themselves, and they've come up with a whole scene that they are developing to communicate this whole year of inquiry that they've undertaken.
So exciting.
I guess all I would say about this is a recent example where I collaborated with Bigelow Laboratory for Ocean Sciences in East Booth Bay. And I did a sculpture of a coccolithophore, and the actual size of the coccolithophore is 2 microns, and so it's essentially 1/10 of the thickness of 1 strand of human hair. And I think you can see it with a type of compound microscope at a really high power, but I think they're typically brought forward as a visual through a scanning electron microscope. And they're usually somewhat jostled and damaged just from the process of even getting them, able to be onto a little teeny piece of paper. But anyway, so the sculpture is just one of these types of coccolithophore that is a 5 foot sphere. And so I think part of what motivated me and what was going on in my mind about, going through what it took to sort of birth this thing was that they are so small that we can't see them. But they exist in the millions and billions right here in the Gulf of Maine. You can see them when they cast off all these calcium carbonate plates. NASA sees them from space, but it's important for that they thrive here and that they can have a healthy system going on here, because they're at the bottom of the food chain and it impacts so many things that come all the way up the line from that food chain. So it was kind of taking something really small and putting it into a different size category to help you to get it that maybe they're small but their impact is huge. And just I guess there probably are other ways that could have been brought forth, but it just it seemed like being able to make the 3-dimensional model of it essentially was gonna help people to get the look around at 360 degrees and really take in the scope of the intricacy of the design of it and the shapes of it. And so I guess that would be an example that I've recently been involved with, where I think that it was communicating something that science can find and discover and bring forth, but for them to put it in a sort of a format that more people can interact with it and have experiences with it, that was able to be communicated that way.
Thank you. My next question is target Alaina here a second, because Harry Gutt's mission is educating students and communities about the connections between the ocean, inland waters, and the economy of Maine. So my question for you, Alaina, is how does art integration fit in Harry Gutt's mission and Phyllis Wyatt's original vision for our organization?
So within our mission, arts integration engages students more deeply into the subject matter. So we've been able to incorporate arts like data art examples that you see on the board while interpreting climate data and changes in the Gulf of Maine, like sea surface temperature increases, sea level rise, and even in as simple as topics that we teach in our Aquatots classes to ages 3 to 5, we incorporate arts and crafts. So students get mini lessons in marine invertebrates, marine mammals, seaweeds, and then they get to do a movement and song piece and then an art piece that they can take home. So they're making connections there and being able to take a memory of that with them. And I still hear from some of the parents that their kids are still talking about aquatots from last year and the year before, and they can't wait to come back. So I think it definitely helps make an impact. And Phyllis Wyeth created this place so that students could connect with marine trades such as raising oysters from spat, growing seaweed in the lobster pound, and being able to run an aquaponics system like a business, so tilapia aquaculture. And if those students that were coming, and those students originally were in alternative education, if they didn't do project-based learning and have integrated subjects and have that science, math, English, history, art pieces all together, like designing and building the system too, they wouldn't have been as engaged. So we've read some historical feedback that those students really had a positive impact on their lives and just kind of changed the course of their lives to kind of become more successful than they originally thought that they would. And I think that integrating art in this area is really important because Mid-Coast Maine has a history of artists that lived and worked and developed their craft on islands like Monhegan and on the mainland. And when students are participating in this artistic culture, they're continuing that culture and connecting with the place that they're in. And then it helps them be able to communicate their scientific knowledge and other knowledge that they're learning through a media that the public can understand more easily.
Thanks, Alaina. And my next question, I'm gonna direct to Julie and Nancy. And you've probably noticed just in the background, the slides rolling by different pictures of programs and then some examples of artwork. So my question for you is, what messages do you hope to convey with your art? And you can just kind of popcorn in.
So I think that the way I look at the work that I do is that it's all in a line of discovery where I don't sort of land on a thing and keep doing it. It's like I always feel like I'm at the beginning of a new endeavor in whatever project I'm on. And that's what keeps it kind of scary, kind of alive. And I think I like that. I like a little bit of pressure that way, I think. But I think that overall, you know, maybe at the end of my life or something, all of those pieces together will, I think, speak to something that is bigger than its individual parts. And, you know, I don't know what the missing pieces are at this point. I don't know, you know, I don't sit down and figure out what I'm gonna do next. Typically the idea comes because I have an encounter with the thing, or, you know, it just kind of keeps coming up in conversation, and then I start to get fascinated by it, and then, you know, then I start to really like it, and then I start loving it, and, you know, then I just can't even let go. So, you know, I think that in some ways, the way that I've been given to live the life that I have is that it's very free. I feel freedom in how my life unfolds because I am able to do these art projects. And I think that in terms of science, I am not wired for the collection of data and repeated experimentation and notation about the different things and the various changes and all of that. So I guess I'm just so thankful and appreciative of whatever information I can glean from any willing scientists who have information to share. And I do think that it is a very symbiotic relationship. I think that we kind of stimulate each other, and so some of what science brings to the table, even through the work that I do, I might not really know that much about it, but a scientist might see the way that I've juxtaposed things and put them out of scale, or, just made what on the outside might look like a combination that wouldn't normally fit together, that, through a deeper investigation of why it fit together for me in my brain, that there's like a common ground that can then be met. And so I think that my work oftentimes is inviting the viewer to question with me things that have to do with life, or why does the great gray owl show up here sometimes, or why aren't there more sturgeon, or just that there are things that go on in our midst that undulate and change and then replenish, and then something else that you took for granted for years goes away, and then that all of a sudden becomes really awesome when it never used to be. So anyway, that's what I've got going on.
I agree with you about the keeping it new piece. It's kind of frustrating for people who like your work because they want you to do the same work that you did 2 years ago, and I'm like, nah. I'm on this new thing now. What's the question? Oh, what message? Okay. So I think so I started out doing a lot of scientific illustration. And I think when I was doing scientific illustration, more than just sort of like showing the organism, I was really interested in kind of showing the specialness of it and kind of the sacredness of it. And in fact, I did this sort of series. There were species icons that were sort of like these religious images of individual organisms, and kind of wanted to point to how sacred these things are and that we should take care of them. But now I'm on a whole different kind of investigation, which has to do with emergent phenomena. I'm really interested in complex systems and emergence so for example, a flock of birds, a murmuration, you've seen those videos of murmurations, right? There's no single bird driving that flock, but yet it has this sort of way that it's going based on environmental conditions, or a hawk that's chasing it or something. And it has to do with each individual entity interacting with each other. And that's the way evolution works. It's the way epidemics work. It's the way city traffic works. It's the way the internet works, the way climate change works. These are complex systems. And I think that the stickiest problems in science communication, and I like to think about, how art can help with science engagement and science communication. The stickiest problems in science communication have to do with emergence, climate change, evolution, epidemics, things that are self-organizing. They're not linear. They're not top-down hierarchies. They're these self-organizing things of millions of entities that somehow create this pattern. And I think it's really hard for our brains to understand that. I know there are other problems with science communication that I won't mention because I'm polite. But I think that understanding emergence is really something that we kind of don't go there often. We don't talk about it. A lot of scientists don't even really understand emergence. So I'm obsessed with it. And the way you say, like, you fall in love with something and you wanna, like, you just think about it and you fall in love with it. Like, I'm really in love with emergence right now. So I'm really kind of going in this direction where I'm trying to find ways that art can convey how emergent systems work.
The next question is for Alexis. So you touched on this a little bit ago, but how do programs like Arts at the Intersection and other Farnsworth community programs play a role in reaching audiences where they're at?
So I think for some of our work, it's literally going to Vinyl Haven or literally going to North Haven if on that day students may have an early release and they don't want to come to the mainland all day. And so sometimes it is literally, or if there's transportation issues for that school, it is literally going to that location and finding ways to remove that barrier, that hurdle. In other ways, it's about building trust and bringing those voices into the space so that you can understand who it is in your community and what those programs should be about or who they should be for. I think a lot of institutions, particularly the Farnsworth right now, and our learning and engagement department is thinking about how can these spaces be more inclusive, bring more folks in, bring more voices in. And are these spaces that young people feel comfortable? Do they feel like they belong here? And if there's a chance that they don't, how do we solve for that? Arts at the intersection, I think that has been one of the big pieces, is how do we bring and elevate local and experiential knowledge within our program. And Alaina mentioned that at the end of the year, we have the student exhibition, and that's a very tangible way, but throughout the whole year, I've been thinking about, so the first year I was working, that I developed the program, I was working with Final Haven, and they've been a really wonderful continuing partner with the program. But the first year, I went out to their classroom, it was the first session, and there's a workshop that we do that's called Artful Looking, where, as I mentioned, you have a work of art, oftentimes a photograph or painting, and you can ask students, what do you notice? And I put up an older photograph by Bernice Abbott from the 1960s, of a lobsterman throwing a lobster off the side of a boat, and had a wooden trap. Didn't say any of this to them. I said, what do you see? And I said, well, there's a Sturman throwing a lobster off the side of the boat because the lobster's too small for them. I said, what? Pretend I know none of those words that you just said. I said, well, how do you know it's a Sturman? So, well, he's on the back of the boat, captain's probably in a wheelhouse. So what's a wheelhouse? So it started playing sort of the gadfly, where you make known all of the things that they know and sometimes take for granted all that knowledge that they have just from living where they live or being in relationship with family members and hearing all the stories or being out on a boat themselves. They knew it was an older picture because the traps are wooden. Traps aren't like that these days. There's a shift to metal traps. And so they knew all those things, but at that moment we're like, well, yeah, of course we know this stuff. I said, you have such incredible knowledge that very few people around the world have. And so lifting up that experiential knowledge and bringing it into the classroom and saying that this is special, this is incredible, and making that a part of the lesson can start from the very first day you're with them by learning and giving opportunities for them to share what it is that they do know as kind of that starting point.
Next question is, I'm gonna throw at all of you, is how can art change the way that a message is received by the audience? And we've touched on it here and there, throughout the other questions, and feel free to jump in.
I think it can make it louder, make the message louder, by literally making it bigger, like how you took that plankton, the cockle at the floor, and made it 5 feet in diameter. And it's just announcing that message to the world then and to the audience. And like I mentioned before, adding an emotional component potentially.
Or I think that art can sometimes trigger memories, like whether it's, the colors involved or just some little part of it, it could trigger fond or, joyful childhood memories or, I think that's what I respond to sometimes in work. And, the emotional aspect of it, I think, is really important. And I think that it's easier for people to connect with a piece of artwork because they don't feel like they have to know any background about it. Maybe. So yeah,
Yeah, I think it's the emotional connection again. There's one of my favorite artists who works with like science communication and data visualization is Maya Lin, who is the architect who did the Vietnam War Memorial, which is also an incredible piece of data visualization, by the way. But she did this piece called Ghost Forest in New York, where she took these trunks of white cedar that had been in a place where they flooded from ocean water and died, and placed them in the middle of Central Park so that people could walk around them. And they really had this ghost-like look to the trunks themselves, were these beautiful, haunting trunks, and like the physicality of it and the presence of it, like bringing them literally into the public sphere, provided an opportunity for us to grieve. I think that, you know, scientists can talk about what's happening, talk about the you know, the data behind the climate and all the things that are happening, but actually providing space for us to be together and sort of like experience this physically and have a place for grief. I think it's really powerful the way art can do that.
I've been thinking, yes, probably some of you are too, about the emerald ash borer beetle, a non-native species that is here, and burrows tiny little holes into ash trees and ends up killing them and decimating, those trees. And you can say this to a young person and, okay, the trees are gonna be gone, there's still always trees around. Not that that's, no one has said that to me, but just imagining worst case scenario and then move on. We had an exhibition on display at the museum, about the history of Penobscot Nation basketry. And Sarah Softbasin, who is an Indigenous artist from Penobscot Nation, has a basket that is made of vinyl blinds out of windows. And so if you know anything about Wabanaki basketry, particularly Penobscot basketry and others, a lot of beautiful, intricate weaving that is very mathematical and symmetrical and artistic. They're incredible, incredible works of art. And she uses alternative materials, found materials, because the ash tree is starting to go away because of this non-native species. And so for students to be able to see all of these baskets made of ash and other and birch, and knowing that this very sacred tree is going to disappear eventually, hopefully not, there's possibly solutions, but they're going, the numbers are falling, and that artists are going to lose this sacred material that they've had for 14,000 years. That makes that emotional connection to them that I think you cannot necessarily do with without that visual, without that personal piece there.
My next question is for Alaina again. So can you describe an experience with a student or a group of students who learn a new STEM concept through art or performing arts or?
Yes, so there have been a variety of times when I've gotten to integrate the arts and music, so performing arts, not just visual arts, to engage different learners. Howard Gardner has a theory of multiple intelligences, so there are maybe up to 8 to 10 different styles of thinking and learning that different students and adults have, that include musical intelligence, naturalist intelligence, interpersonal, intrapersonal, spiritual, I think is a new one they added to it. And so anytime that you can integrate other subjects that touch upon those different learners will engage those students into any of the STEM topics. So I remember one time I was facilitating an activity in the beginning of my teaching career, and I was actually substitute teaching, but I was in a 4th grade room, and it was a project-based learning day. And so that was one of my first introductions to project-based learning. And the students were building tree houses and integrating, calculating area, calculating volume, designing a 3-dimensional model or sculpture, and able to build it too. So there were a lot of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics skills that they were applying within this project. But I remember just seeing their eyes get big, and they're like, okay, well, I have this area, and this is what it looks like, and now I can physically see the difference between a 2-dimensional area and a 3-dimensional volume, and they're creating these shapes and calculating different shapes that they're putting together to make an odd or asymmetrical shape within their treehouse. And then they got to communicate their science to the room, explaining how they did the design and how it's balancing and not falling over. So there were a lot of physics concepts in there, but just seeing how excited they were that they had ownership over the project. They weren't just reading a textbook or memorizing something, they were designing and building and creating and integrating that all together. So that was pretty incredible. So then I was able to pull some of that into my future lesson planning and incorporate some project-based learning and continue that inspiration and that increased engagement of my students.
Now I want a treehouse and hearing that. So Alexis, as we all know here, Maine has a really long history of art that's connected to place and famous artists like the Wyatts. So how can place-based art connect us to our local environment and create environmental stewards?
Yeah, I feel this is place-based learning is a big part of the Department of Education's goals for a lot of schools, because all of the benefits that it brings out, and feeling lucky that I work for a museum that is dedicated to Maine's role in American art. And so, as you mentioned, everything that we have in our collection around view has to do with this place we call Maine. I think what I've seen is when there is a personal connection, that's always a good first step to get a student engaged. When they feel personally or individually connected to a topic or to a work of art, they'll stay with you longer throughout any lesson or any project. Over time, and this does take time because it's usually very deep learning. But going back to something Nancy said at the very beginning, this connection between art and science, having one of the commonalities is having a question or inquiry at the heart of it. Place-based learning allows us to ask questions about the environment, the land, the people, the history that we live in, and asking questions about the things that might impact us or our community allow us to also find answers that might impact our people we know or the place we live. And as I mentioned earlier, like one of my questions that I've been asking is, who has power to make decisions, who's at the table in those decision-making processes? And when you're asking questions and answering questions from local experts, it helps you strengthen your relationship with those around you. And again, the impacts of the work that you're doing will also be felt by you, and just increasing engagement and their buy-in to a lot of these projects.
Thank you. I'm shifting gears a little bit to Julie. So we heard about your giant plankton sculpture. So what inspired you to focus on Gulf of Maine plankton in your exhibition? And this might be a silly question, but what is your favorite plankton?
All right, well, the road that it took to get to the collaboration with Bigelow was pretty simple. I had Google searched diatoms, which the diatom category are my favorite plankton. They're silica exoskeletons and they're, like jewelry or something. They're gem-like, they're beautiful. But I didn't approach Bigelow with diatoms because Chrisanne Baker had recently done a big installation there with beautiful upcycled glass, and she did this fabulous diatom display there. So that wasn't really so much of an option that I thought would be a good fit. But I had ended up at the Shoals Marine Lab as an artist in residence for a 2-week time period, and I had to work with students there. And so there were maybe 4 classrooms of students that I had to work with, and so like on one of those classes, I got to go out and we did I think it's called a plankton tow or plankton, yeah. So we did it at night, and we would drag from like a specific point in the ocean to like another specific point, and the mesh and the the way the cone of the mesh was a certain size and different. And, so we bring all that stuff in, you can see the bioluminescent stuff and they're putting it into these buckets, and then we went back to the lab and we started looking at things under the microscope. So here I am thinking, oh, I can't wait to see a diatom. Well, we didn't see any diatoms, and, it's because they're a little bit smaller than what we were actually towing for, and so those things were probably filtering through this mesh, and so, that's how I got exposed to, like, the dinoflagellates and the copepods and like krill or bean shrimps and things, and so it just kind of got me thinking a lot more about, well, what does it take to see the diatoms, and and what does it take to see a coccolithophore? So when I got done with that residency, I just emailed Bigelow Lab, just a general email, and asked them if they would consider talking about potentially collaborating on a coccolithophore sculpture project together. And I will tell you that the one that I ended up doing this big sculpture of is not the one that I went in there thinking I was gonna want to do. The one that I am very attracted to, which isn't as common here in the Gulf of Maine, is called Discosphaera tubifera. And so the central part of the sphere, out from that central part are these things that look like, bugles, or these like trumpet bell shaped, or they might look like chanterelle mushrooms, all coming out from the center. And so when they scatter, each individual one looks like this horn, or something to blast sound out of. Anyway, that was the one that I had hoped to do, and I still actually might do that one eventually. But I'm really glad that I did Emiliania huxleyi, which now has a different name. It's like Jeffrocopsa or something, huxleyi. So that one's name got changed, but you can still call it Emiliania. They'll know what you're talking about. But anyway, I learned so much doing that one and recognized that trying to do Discosphaera tubifera would have pretty much been impossible with the materials that I used for the other ones. So that's how I got involved. And yeah, my favorite plankton are the diatoms, which there are many different shapes of. But I like the centric ones the best. And then of course I like the Discosphaera tubifera coccolithophore, but there are radiolarians that I really like too. I mean, come on, they're all so good. So I could change my mind tomorrow.
Yeah, I really appreciate some of the historical illustrations of different plankton by Ernst Haeckel. So those are some of my favorites. So moving on to Nancy, can you talk a bit about art and science in the field a bit, and how your career as a science communicator, has evolved over time?
Okay, that's 2 questions. Not sure I can get to both of them, but I just want to pause and say how much I'm excited about being in a room where we're talking about our favorite plankton. That doesn't happen all the time. That was really fun. I don't have a favorite plankton. So Art and Science in the Field, asIF Center, was a art science residency in the mountains of North Carolina that I set up for a couple of years. And now I've relocated. I live in central Massachusetts, in Petersham, Massachusetts. So it's sort of asIF 2.0. And it's a studio. It's not really a residency program. But the idea of the studio is that it's a shared space, and I do invite artists and scientists to come and work there. There are several studio rooms, and it's also in the same town as a biological field station. So the intention is to build a relationship between artists and scientists that would work in harmony with that field station. I love biological field stations and marine labs. And I love arts residencies, and I think there's some things that they have in common. They're kind of these transient communities. So they are these communities of people that come together, bring their work, or they're at that place because that work is in that place, like the field stations are places where scientists come to work and study things that are in that landscape and use it as a living laboratory. It creates this kind of like ongoing, ever-changing environment of exchange of ideas, and people will, sit around and have dinner or sit on the porch or share a cup of coffee or a beer, and sort of like these conversations about like, oh, beetles do that? That's really interesting because that's also happening in the fishes that I study. And like sometimes that turns into a collaboration or somebody's dissertation or something. And these relationships persist beyond the field station. And they're just really incredibly wonderful communities. And so I created asIF Center and asIF Studio as a way to sort of like participate in that energy and to put art and science on equal footing. I'm really interested in bringing art into biological field stations. I'm also really interested, my day job is working at an arts residency program. I'm really interested in bringing science into arts programs and like merging those two because they have so much in common really and a lot to exchange with each other. That interdisciplinary exchange is really exciting to me. There are not a lot of places that really put them on equal footing, and that's kind of the purpose of that. What was the other half of the question? I'll try to be brief. My career is a science communicator.
Yeah, not that at all.
I am thinking more about process and about sharing the making process and the questioning process and the curiosity that you were talking about, like the whys, why does this exist? I'm thinking like that is more interesting to me when I work with students, and when I'm making, I'm really much more interested in sort of like organic, changing, ongoing processes than I am in like a finished work of art or a finished poster or whatever. I'm really interested in process stuff.
We have time to squeeze in one more question before we turn it over to the audience for questions. So this is open to anyone who feels up to answering. What do you envision for the future of art and STEM in our communities? That's a bit of a big question.
I think schools are really waking up to the sort of benefits, the sort of richness that is available to us when we bring art and science together, and that's really exciting to me. I feel like it's a hot topic. Everybody's talking about STEAM and art and science or art-science or sci-art. It's kind of like, because it's kind of hip to talk about it, it's kind of everywhere. I think there is also, the flip side of that coin is because it's kind of ubiquitous, it has lost some of its meaning. And so like we have to be really precise about what we're talking about when we say art and science. Well, are you talking about art that communicates science? Are you talking about an artist that's collaborating with a scientist? Are you talking about an artist who's using some stuff from science to make art? Like, I think there's a lot of different tentacles that this thing has. I think it's all really exciting, but I think the future, we really need to be precise about intention and like where we're coming from and what our goals are and what's going on.
And when you walk into schools, you can see all that student art and science all around the walls and in the middle of the lobby, and it's pretty exciting to see. And I was surprised a couple years ago when I saw at St. George School, they had a 3D printer. So students were using very modern pieces of technology to create art. And I think it'll be interesting to see where things go with AI and if there will be regulations or if students will just be able to use that to the extent that they want to create things too. Because I think it'd be great to preserve the problem solving skills, the natural creativity, the sense of wonder that's in everybody, and not have technology surpass or cover that up, but just be sometimes used as an assistive tool. But yeah, I think that there's going to be all kinds of new technology that we don't even know about right in this moment that is going to be developed and integrated as well in creating some art.
I'd like to see more intergenerational community hubs for young people and adults of all generations, to be able to connect around these topics. Being a community member here, in Tenants Harbor and St. George. I know that, the school is working really hard on, the maker space and getting that up and running, and I know there's gonna be opportunities for folks that come in, older folks that come in and teach younger folks. But what does the space look like, whether it's in Rockland or somewhere else here in the Mid-Coast, where anyone can drop in? And have that, I know that is so hard to do with logistically, I've even been thinking about it, but just what does an intergenerational space look like where folks that can share across ages?
I love libraries.
Yeah.
Oh, well, unless you wanted to add anything, I think we can open it up to any audience questions, and I will ask Sarah to help me with the Zoom questions if there are any. So if anybody would like to ask any of the panelists any questions about their work, or
I've got about 5 or 10 minutes, so room for 1 or 2.
I just like to say, what an excellent panel, really thought provoking, and I couldn't help thinking that a couple of days ago I was in the village of Tenants Harbor and I saw kids walking around different sizes, and then I looked down and they'd done sidewalk chalk art all over the place, on the street, on the parking lot, and I thought, this is great. And we need to free kids with their imagination, spark their imagination, well, they have it already, we just need to not squelch it.
Yeah, I too really appreciate the conversation. It's been very inspiring and intriguing and interesting, and yeah, it's been great. And I mean, I was just talking to somebody recently about, we were talking about the world of medicine and how medicine has become so science technologically bound, and that we've sort of lost the doctors who use art and science, you know, who are willing to be daring and explore and do the what if and why not questioning. And so with that, in a lot of this discussion, I hear that confluence of the, you know, science is very technical and precise, and it gets very stuck, I think, in and solidified in what its belief system is. And I think art is really helpful in trying to loosen that up and ask the bigger other questions. And I just really appreciate this conversation, because it's obviously a process, an ongoing process, and the conversation about STEAM or STEM or sci-art I think it's really, really important as we move forward as educators to really use that precision as well as the exploration. In terms of educating kids.
And using our hands, you know,
Yeah.
we have these things that we don't really use that much anymore, except to do this or
Yeah.
this, you know?
Yeah.
But I mean, that, you know, 150 years ago, we all were doing a lot with our hands all the time, and we were all
Whole
craft
body.
people with our whole
And our
bodies.
whole body, yeah.
And it's funny that you should bring up the medical field. There's one of my favorite scientific, I don't think you can call it a scientific illustrator, but like art science people from history is Santiago Ramon y Cajal, who is sort of considered the father of modern neuroscience. You should look him up. These beautiful drawings of nerves, of the retina of a cat's eye, and he's actually used drawing to discover how the shapes of nerves are, because up until that point we didn't really know about them as individual nerves in our brains, like we just thought it was sort of gray matter. And he used stains and a microscope to see them, but he actually used drawings in order to, as a tool for discovery. And that's like, is that art or is that science? Like, it's both. It's, you know, using our eyes and our hands, our imagination, and, you know, there's an emotional component to it. I think we've kind of drifted apart in this way of like separating the very rational part of ourselves from the creative and thinker part of ourselves, and the whole self.
And that heavy observational component of science really lends itself to that intersection with the arts.
Yeah, drawing actually makes us better observers.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think it's really a great tool for learning.
You know, I spend like several hundred hours on woodcuts, and I think that people are always wondering, how can you spend that much time doing it? And I think part of the answer is that I just love it. I love the sound of the carving going on. You know, there's something that like the repeated pattern of it, I think you know, maybe it's like women that used to get together or still do get together to knit or to, you know, peel potatoes, or, you know, like that there are things that your brain has access to when it's on a longer haul of being preoccupied with something, that you think further than you would if you were all interrupted, or, you know. And so I think that the launch of periods of time, I mean, I can carve for, you know, like a 4-hour chunk of time. Well, the things that you're thinking about that whole time, it's really amazing what can occur during those types of time periods. I'm sure other people have it in their own ways, but I find that with you know, doing artwork as opposed to, you know, collecting you know, images from, you know, a collection of water out in the seas near Bermuda. I mean, I love to have access to all of those images, but it's not a process of engaging in something, observing something, and then like, I think just swimming in that for long periods of time, where your brain can put more ideas about it together. And I know that for me, there might be a whole bunch of arguments involved with that discussion. And, you know, and so you're whacking through all these, you know, maybe criticism, or, you know, why are you spending this much time doing this? Or shouldn't we be doing this instead? So, you know, you're processing through a lot of different ways about what's important in those processes, I think.
We have one question online. And Jason, if you can hear me, you can just jump in with your question. I'm trying to stop that slideshow, but anyway, we've got a few people online, and
Hello.
Jason saying hi, but you can't see him, I can.
That's okay. Hi, how's everyone doing?
Good.
I just from an application standpoint, I work as a digital media assistant for rather in higher ed, and I was wondering if you had any ideas on how to develop curricula that are you know, integral of both art and science.
Yes.
And I don't know if I missed this part of the presentation before I had to take my little peanut out for a walk. So
I mean, that's a bigger question. I mean, I spend a lot of time teaching art in a science context. I really like to, you know, I think I have some mischievous part of myself that likes to be in the wrong party. So I like to place myself as an artist in a science classroom and use art as a tool for teaching biology, for example, or using nature journaling kind of in a sophisticated way in a higher education setting to teach ecology to students, and helping students think of themselves both as artists and as scientists. Because I think that the process, and for me it's drawing, but there are many different ways of combining art. That just happens to be my medium. But I think that drawing is a powerful tool for helping students become better observers. And that observation is a starting point for science questions. You know, a lot of science questions start with a why or a structure function question. And I agree with you, and when you're working on something for 4 hours or something, you see things that you wouldn't see if you weren't spending so much time. And that time spent is, I sort of use drawing in this sort of students don't realize it, what I'm really asking them to do is please stare at something for 10 minutes. It's really small. And, you know, but I'm asking them to draw and I'm giving them all these tools. What I want them to do is stare at something for 10 minutes and ask questions. So I feel like drawing is a great way to invite you into that space of just focus and wondering like, what's that little hairy puff doing there? What is that for? You know, because that's what gets those questions started. That's just one way.
Another way is you could start with a phenomenon in nature and stare at that for a while and ask the questions that Alexis brought up, like what do you notice? What do you wonder? And then launch an investigation from there where the students are leading it, but you know in the background where you want to go. And it's just posing a lot of questions and having students ask those questions and then keep looking closer. I'm thinking of at an elementary level with literally magnifying lenses and then developing more research questions to finding answers to, but using drawing as they go, using journaling as they go. So just integrating the subjects, looking at learning standards and combining them. For higher ed, I did get to work with Stacy Dora's class for computer science, and we studied Jill Pelto for a day and looked at her climate data, and they found their own graphs that they were interested in. And they did hand sketches and then watercolor paintings of their data, adding images. And then by the end of the year, they turned that into a digital format and built data art pieces based on the skills they were learning in their college computer science class. So you could start with the phenomenon, you can also just start outright brainstorming ways to combine the two together physically as an art piece.
I also think there are a lot more interdisciplinary courses popping up, you know, on college campuses. There are a lot of co-teaching opportunities that pop up for, you know, combining art and science.
Would you, sorry, just to follow up if I may, do you feel that data visualization techniques would be a useful crossover for presenting, you know, both the art and the science in sort of a unified discipline? And do you feel that that would be a great way to help facilitate more transaction between the arts and the sciences?
Yeah, there's a lot of really great data visualization out there. Jill Pelto's work is one example, but there's also like data sonification is another aspect that's really interesting, where a musician will take data and assign sounds to it so that we can actually hear a graph. There are countless examples of artists who are taking a graph and sort of like making it three-dimensional and physical. You could walk through, and so yeah, there are a lot of really creative ways to work with data visualization.
How do you spell that person's name? I'm sorry.
Oh, Jill Pelto
Yes.
is Pelto, and I believe she's in
Thank
this
you.
community.
Yeah,
I've been
Okay.
using her
I just-
slides, talking about data visualization for years, and it turns out that she's right here, so.
Yeah, she went to UMaine and just a year or two ago, she moved to Washington State, but she still connects with their
Oh,
students
that's
here.
cool. She's really, really interesting work.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for coming down here to Herdnut, and for everyone on Zoom, thank you for attending our first Spring Fever series of the year. And thank you to all of our panelists for coming all this way, especially Nancy, who came quite a ways from Mass. And we appreciate our partners like the Farnsworth and Julie for fun art integration projects. So let's just go ahead to our panelists.
thank you, Katie, for getting this all set
Thank you
up.
so much.
Thanks, Jason. I forgot to introduce myself at the beginning too. I'm Sarah Ochai. Don't forget to check all of our new events coming up. We will keep you busy until the end of the month and all the way until sometime in September. So please join us for the next event. Thank you all to the panelists. This was fantastic. And thanks for the audience for staying here with us. They're all waving.
I can see you, but they can't.
Seriously. Yeah, it's a long drive, it's 3 hours. This meeting.
Get together more often.
I know.